Welcome to this tutorial on procedural content generation in Unreal Engine 5. In this lesson, we'll focus our attention on some basics and build our way towards more intermediate content. Some of the topics we'll explore in this tutorial include adding free assets from Fab, installing the PCG plugins and navigating the PCG graph, creating PCG volumes, spawning static meshes into our PCG graph, using difference nodes to exclude data points, use an attribute filter to isolate landscape material data, use subgraphs to communicate between PCG graphs, and create hero props with data assets. By the end of this lesson, you'll have a solid understanding of PCG and be on your way to creating stunning dynamic environments using a variety of techniques and 3D assets. For this example, we'll use the third-person template in Unreal Engine version 5.5.1. We're also going to use Fab to access some free marketplace assets, specifically the simple stylized forest and low poly hand-painted environment. Keep in mind that when adding in the low poly hand-painted environment into your project, you might run into a compatibility issue with the version of Unreal Engine we're using. I'll show you how to easily resolve this issue later in the tutorial. As an additional aspect to this tutorial, we will briefly go over how to prepare a simple landscape and how to apply the material included in one of the free asset packs. So without further delay, go ahead and create a basic third-person template project. No starter content is required for this lesson. As your project is loading up, many of you might be wondering, what is PCG? Well, Procedural Content Generation is a method for automating the creation of content, such as levels, objects, and environments using predefined rules and algorithms. This approach saves time, enhances creativity, and allows for endless variations in game design and world building. At this point, make sure your third-person project has loaded. If it hasn't, go ahead and give this video a pause. Now that your project has loaded, we can go to the top toolbar and select Edit, Plugins, and in the search field, we're going to search for PCG. Next, we need to install two of the PCG plugins, the Procedural Content Generation Framework and the Procedural Content Generation Framework Geometry Script Interop. Let's go ahead and toggle those on, and you'll notice that we'll get a warning. This is just letting us know that it is in beta mode and is most likely unstable. So let's go ahead and click Yes on both of these, and you'll notice that we need to restart the editor. So go ahead and click on that restart button now. Let's now go to Window, Load Layout, and let's select the UE4 Classic layout. I'm just going to go ahead and dock the Place Actors tab to the sidebar. This will provide me with more screen space. Next, let's go to the content browser, select Content, and we can add two new folders. The first one we'll call PCG, and the second one we'll call Maps. Let's go ahead and set a new color on these folders. I'm just going to right click on each of them and set a color. Pick whichever color you'd prefer. So right click, set color, choose a new color. There we go. So now that our PCG plugins are installed and our folders are created, we can go into the PCG folder, right click, and you'll see the PCG graph. We're going to select the PCG graph, and let's call this one PCG underscore landscape. We're then going to go to File, up here at the top, New Level. We're going to select the basic level, click Create, and let's go ahead and delete this floor and this player start. With the floor and player start removed, we can go to the selection mode and choose landscape. Here we're going to leave the default settings as they are and go ahead and click Create. Alright, great. So now we can start sculpting by holding down the left mouse button to create mountains. And if we hold down the left shift key and start sculpting, we'll end up creating valleys or craters. So go ahead and make something pretty basic. We don't need anything spectacular. Just keep it fairly simple for now, and we can make some adjustments later on. Alright, so now that we've got a little bit of variation in the landscape, we're going to go ahead and get back into selection mode. You can press Shift 1, and we're going to add in a couple of volumes. So to do that, let's go to the Place Actors tab, or alternatively, you could click on this button right here and search for the volume that you're looking for. I like using the Place Actors tab, so I'm just going to go ahead and search for a light mass importance volume. Drag that into my scene. Now this isn't necessary for PCG, but a light mass importance volume is recommended to prioritize lighting inside the volume. Now let's go ahead and change the brush settings here to something like 5,000 by 5,000 by 5,000. So most of our light bounces will remain within this importance volume. Now let's go to the Place Actors tab and search for PCG. We're going to add in a PCG volume. Let's go ahead and position this. And you can scale your PCG volume as well using the brush tools. I wouldn't recommend using the scale tools here, and currently it shows that this one is set to 25 by 25 by 10. I'd actually reduce those to 1 by 1 by 1. And we're just going to scroll down to the brush settings, and I'm going to change the size in the brush settings to 5,000 by 5,000 by 5,000. And I'm actually going to copy the transform of my light mass importance volume. So the location specifically, I'm going to copy that. And my PCG volume, I'll just go ahead and select it and paste those coordinates so that they line up. So now my light mass importance volume and my PCG volume are the same size and located in the same position. We could probably reduce the z-axis value to something like 3,000. That should be good. Excellent. So let's go ahead and save this before we forget. Currently our level doesn't have a name, and so we can go ahead and click on File, Save Current Level As. We're going to select the Maps folder, so go ahead and select it here, and we're going to give this a name. Let's call it Level 1, and save. Let's also make sure to save all the assets in our content browser by clicking Save All, Save Selected. After everything has saved successfully, we're going to go to our outliner, scroll down, and select the PCG volume. Then we're going to go to the settings under PCG component and expand graph instance, and you'll see there's a spot for the graph that we created earlier, which is the PCG landscape. If you click on the drop down, you'll see that that's the only graph that we have available. So you can select it, and now we can actually open up the PCG landscape graph. So let's go ahead and double click on that. Let's talk about the layout for our PCG graph. Here we have our main viewport. Similar to blueprints, you can just hold down your right mouse button and move around. Over on the left hand side, you'll see the node palette. The node palette contains a list of all of the nodes that we can use inside of our graph. You can also access these nodes by right-clicking and searching for them. At the very top here, we have our general toolbar. The toolbar allows us to pause or force the regeneration of our procedurally generated content. For those of you with slower computers, I would recommend turning on pause regen and only selecting force regen when necessary. At the bottom here, in this panel, we have our debug tree. The debug tree contains a list of all of the PCG volumes that exist in our environment. Here we have our PCG component with the PCG landscape graph added to it. Next to that is the attributes list. And as we start adding in nodes, I'll explain how we can use this attributes list to get specific data that will allow us to filter out points in our graph. To visualize this data, the first thing we can do is right-click and search for Get Landscape Data. This node will allow us to get the points that exist on the landscape. We can get data for various types of assets, including meshes, splines, actors, and so on. To visualize the points on the Get Landscape Data, we can first select it and then press the D key or right-click and select Debug. If I minimize this, with Debug toggled, you will see that it allows us to get all of the points on our landscape. I'm just going to disable Debug now. And the next thing we're going to want to do is sample the surface. So we could either drag out from the node or just simply right-click and add in a surface sampler. We're going to plug the landscape data into the surface sampler. The surface sampler is going to allow us to control how many points appear on our surface. If we go ahead and put this in debug mode now, you'll see that all of the points on the landscape are now isolated to the volume. And in addition to that, the amount of points has been reduced compared to what we saw earlier with the landscape being completely covered in what appeared to be like one massive point. So let's go back to our graph here. Press the D key again to disable the debug on that asset. We can also inspect these nodes by right-clicking and selecting Inspect or using the hotkey A to toggle that on and off. You won't see any data appear in the attributes list, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on the debug tree and select my component. And here you'll see we'll have tons of data regarding the position, the rotation, scale, etc. If our surface or our landscape had any materials, we'd actually see the names of the materials in this section. We're actually going to be using that later on once we assign materials to our landscape. So let's go ahead and turn off the inspect on there. Let's save this really quickly. And currently we don't actually have any 3D models, so this is where gaining access to Fab Assets is going to come in handy. To add in assets, we're going to simply go to Window, Fab, and Fab will load up for us. Now, the Fab assets that we need specifically are simple stylized forest. So in this search field, I'm going to go ahead and click. I'm going to type in simple stylized forest, press enter, and here we go. It should be the first thing that pops up. Let's go ahead and click on that. And if you don't already have it in your library, make sure to add it to your library. The next thing we're going to do is click on Add to Project. And you'll see that it's going to download to your project. This may take some time. Alright, so once that's done, we're going to go back and search for the low poly hand painted environment. Now this one might be a little bit harder to locate. So let's go ahead and press enter first. It doesn't show up right away, so we're just going to go to price, set that to free. We're also going to go to rating and set that to 4 stars and up. And it should be the second option in that list. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the exact assets that I'm using. I just find that these ones are pretty handy and they have everything we need for this specific tutorial. So let's go ahead and click on the low poly hand painted environment. If it's not added into your library, go ahead and do that. You'll notice that there's a compatibility issue where it says it's only supported for versions 4.18 to 5.4. That's okay. We're just going to add this to our project anyways. And we'll get this asset not compatible pop-up. Let's just choose the version closest to the version of Unreal Engine that we're using, which is going to be this one here, 5.4. And I'm just going to add this to my project. This may take some time, so go ahead and pause the video, go get a coffee, and then come back to it. Now that we have the hand-painted environment and simple forest assets added to our project, we can go to the PCG folder, double-click on our PCG landscape graph, and in this empty space, we're going to right-click and search for a static mesh spawner. Go ahead and add that in, and we're going to connect the surface sampler to the static mesh spawner. Because we don't actually have a mesh assigned to the spawner, you won't see anything appear on your landscape. So let's go ahead and with the static mesh spawner selected, we're going to go to mesh entries. We're going to add a new array element, expand index 0, and we're going to choose a new descriptor asset, in this case the static mesh, which we will set to tree underscore 01. So sm tree 01, go ahead and add that in. And when I minimize this, you'll see that the trees appear on our landscape now. However, they're all rotated on the z-axis in the same direction, as well as the y and x. However, with the landscape variation, you'll notice that they're rotated at an awkward angle. What we're going to look for next is a transform points. Right click and search for a transform points. So we're going to add that in, and let's just drag this. Let's just hold down Control and drag this pin, drag this line to the transform points, and we're just going to position it like so. Let's debug the transform points quickly by pressing the D key on that selected node. And if we go back into the editor, you'll actually see these cubes. Now let's actually disable the trees really quick. So you can select your static mesh spawner and press the E key, and that will disable this spawner so that all we'll see is the point data. Now the points are represented on a scale of 0 to 1, so 0 being black and 1 being white. 0 represents the lowest value or absence of data at that specific point, and white represents the highest value or maximum influence of that point. Gray is everything in between. So this allows us to control things like the density of the points. We can mask or filter out various points. We can use this to fine-tune our debugging, and we can use this to fine-tune the distribution of assets that appear in our project. So let's go back to the graph editor, and let's re-enable the static mesh spawner, and let's toggle off the debug on our transform points. If you look over here where I have these trees growing, you'll notice that they're at a pretty abrupt angle. We're going to want to change the transform of these trees. So what we'll do is with our transform point selected, we're going to turn on absolute rotation. And I'll just bring this down here. When you look at this, you'll see that if I click on absolute rotation, it'll kind of straighten those trees up for us. So now if we start painting, the trees will actually be a little bit more vertical. And so we can do all sorts of other things. We can give our trees more rotation. So here in the rotation max, I'm going to set the Z axis to 360, and that'll give us a full 360-degree rotation, and this will just randomize those points for us. So let's go ahead and quickly save our node, and let's look at that. So as you can see here, the trees are rotated a little bit more organically, so that's giving us some more variation. Great. We'll probably want to do some other things like change the offset. So let's actually give the Z min and the Z max something like -10, so that if we have some steep hills, the base of the tree will be less likely to protrude from the side of the hill. We'll also adjust some of the scale values, so I'll want some smaller trees, so maybe some at 0.7. And because this is a locked value, you can just leave it as it is. You only have to type in one value and that will override the others. And maybe for a maximum value, I'll set that to 1.1. And so now we can actually see a little bit more variation in the height of our trees as well as the scale. So it's starting to look a little bit more organic. One issue that we're having though right now is that some of the trees are actually going to be spawning inside of others, especially if we start adding additional trees into this graph. So what we'll do is we'll add in a self-pruning node. So just type in prune, and there we go. We've got a self-pruning node, and we can actually just place that right before the transform points. So using the control and drag method, we're going to plug that into the output like so, and just plug the surface sampler into the self-pruning node. Let's straighten these nodes out by selecting them all and press the Q key. So what the Q key will do is it will line your nodes horizontally. If you want to line them up vertically, you could press and hold Control-Shift-S, and that will line those nodes up like so. Now if we take a look back at our scene, not a lot has changed. In fact, you probably won't notice anything different, but what the pruning does is it prevents these trees or these objects from overlapping each other. So let's go ahead and add in a few more assets. With the static mesh spawner selected, you can see we currently only have one array entry. Let's add a couple more in. Actually, let's add in 3 more. So we should have 4 in total. In index 1, I'm going to go ahead and add in tree underscore 02. In index 2, I'm going to add in tree underscore 03. And in index 3, I'm going to add tree underscore 04. And because as this is set up currently, these trees don't actually have any collision on them. So we can go to each of these and expand them, and under collision presets, they are currently set to no collision. I'm going to change that to block all. I'm going to do that for each of these trees. You'll also notice that there's a weight option for each of these assets, and we're going to use that to determine the probability of trees that exist in our volume. Okay, so I could give this one a probability of, like, let's say 8, 6, 4. No, that's not what it will be. So, okay. So anyways, as you can see, we now have all these trees in here, and they're of varying heights and varying rotations. And to give this a little bit more of an interesting look, I'm just going to go to the transform points, and I'm actually going to go to this rotation minimum, and I'm going to set the rotation min on the X and Y to negative, let's say 10. This might be too much. We could probably reduce this later. And the max will be 10 as well. Yeah, that's quite substantial. So let's actually change that to negative 5 and 5. We don't want it to be too abrupt, but just a little bit of variation. That way will help make this look more natural. All right, so now that we've got the trees in place, let's go ahead and add in some rocks. So doing what we did here, we're going to just right click and search for a surface sampler. And let's move this get landscape data over here. We could actually take this landscape data and we'll break the connection here. And what we'll use instead is we'll use a named reroute node. So let's go ahead and right click and type in named, and you'll see we have the named reroute node. Because of a bug in Unreal Engine 5.5, we won't actually be able to name this node inside of the details panel. So you can just select it and press the F2 key. And I'm just going to call this one tree spawner, or yeah, tree spawner. Not tree spanner. I'm going to just call it tree spawner. And I'm going to create another named reroute node called rock spawner. And I'll create one more called grass spawner. And if you want to add more, feel free to do so, but we're just sticking with these for now. So we're getting all of the landscape data, and we're plugging that into these named reroute nodes. And the named reroute node essentially acts as this line. However, it can get quite chaotic when we have a ton of lines all over the place, and it's probably a good habit to try and keep your project as organized and clean as possible. So let's go ahead and click on this named reroutes. I'm going to choose the tree spawner and plug that directly into the surface sampler for my trees. I'm also going to comment this, and I'll just call it trees. You can change the color of your comment box as well. And I'm going to add in my named reroute here for the rocks. I'm just going to plug that in like so. And let's just quickly debug this so we can actually see that right here. You'll notice that the points are overlapping some of the trees. We're going to resolve that issue very soon. So let's disable that. Let's toggle off debug. And what we're going to do here is we're going to, of course, prune these rocks. So self-prune. And we're probably going to want to get a transform point. So let's go and add that in. And we're also going to want to spawn in a static mesh. So get the static mesh spawner. And before we connect the static mesh spawner, let's just take a quick look at these points. So we're going to click on the transform points here. And let's give this some variation in rotation and scale. So I'm going to go ahead and set the min rotation to negative. Better yet, I'm going to set the maximum rotation to 360 on the X, Y, and Z. That's going to give us some wild rotation on these assets. Some dynamic rotation. We can toggle on absolute rotation, And if you'd like, you can toggle on absolute offset. It's up to you. I'm also going to set the offset min to -5, and I'll do that on both the positive or the max and minimum for the offset. We can have some variety in scale. I'll use absolute scale and disable uniform. I'll set this to something like 0.25, and we'll set that to 1.1 as well. So we're going to get some variation in rock sizes. Now let's go ahead and plug the transform points into our static mesh spawner. We're going to disable the debug on our transform points, and with our static mesh spawner selected, we're going to go ahead and add in 3 mesh entries. For the first one, we're going to choose a rock asset, and if we press Control Space, we can actually search through some of the assets that exist in our Simple Force project folder. And I'm going to go to Meshes, Rocks, and we've got these 3 rocks here, SM Rock 01, 02, and 03, and these are the ones we're going to be adding in to the static mesh spawner. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. And let's also make sure that we turn collision on these objects. Under collision presets, we're going to change that to block all. We're going to do that for each of these. Okay, and let's go ahead and take a look at our scene. So now we've got all these rocks strewn about throughout this environment, but you'll notice that some rocks actually are smashing into trees, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It also doesn't look very good, so we're going to fix that really quickly. And to do that, we're going to need a difference node. So let's quickly just put a comment box around these. We're just going to call this rocks. And I'm going to leave the color as it is. And I'm going to line those up. All right, so let's add in our difference node. So if you type in difference, you'll see this node right here. All right, so how does the difference node work? Well, the way it works is we want to assign a source, which would be whatever we don't want, whatever point we don't want to be excluded. And difference is whatever we want to exclude from the source. So if we have a rock overlapping our tree and we don't want that rock there, then we'll make sure that that's plugged into the differences input. So let's see that in action. If we select our differences node and we plug the transform points, let's actually break this connection here. We'll hold down Alt and break the connection here. We'll do the same over at the rocks where the transform points is attached to the static mesh spawner. So we'll break that connection. And from the transform points output, we're going to take the transform points from our trees, plug that into the source, and from our rocks output from the transform points, we're plugging that into the difference. And let's actually connect the rocks back to the static mesh spawner, and we're going to plug this difference node into static mesh spawner. It's going to create this this additional node for us, so let's go ahead and expand this comment box a little bit, and we can just reposition these nodes. Alright, so now that the nodes are repositioned, we can quickly view what's happening, but you'll notice that actually we can quickly view what's happening, but you'll notice that nothing will really change. And that's because of the density function that we have set currently. As you can see, we still have rocks that are overlapping. And let's see if we can find a better example. There we go. So we've got some rocks that are overlapping, and that's obviously not what we want. So in order to remedy this, we can just go ahead and select the differences node, and under density function, we want to set this to binary. After setting it to binary, you'll see that we no longer have that overlap. But we also lose a lot of density. We can fix this issue with density in a couple of ways. If we go back into our graph, you'll see if we select our surface sampler, we can actually change the amount of points that exist per meter squared, the looseness of these points, and the extents of our points. So with the trees, let's set this to something like 200 by 200 by 200 on the points extent. You'll see it makes all of these trees vanish. If we reduce this value, or better yet, let's reduce the looseness to 0.1. So the looseness will provide us with some trees. We're going to go back into our graph, and we're going to resolve the density issue momentarily, but let's first actually get rid of this difference node. We'll add it back in later on. I'm going to go ahead and delete that connection as well, and I'm going to connect these transform points to my static mesh spawner. Now, we can mess with these surface sampler nodes to modify some of the density. So for instance, if I were to select the surface sampler for my rocks, I can then go ahead and change this looseness value to something like 0.5, and that's going to spread those rocks about a little bit differently. I can also select the surface sampler for my trees, and if I set the looseness on here to 1.2, kind of spread those out a little bit more. It'll make the spread a little bit more loose. And if I increase this value for my point extents, you'll see that it makes the trees a bit more sparse. If I reduce this value, I'll have a much more dense forest. I think I'm going to set it to 200 for now, just to keep it fairly open. Because when I add in the rocks, or sorry, when I add in the, because when I add in the grass, it will start to look a little bit more lush. So let's go ahead and add in our grass spawner with the surface sampler. So in our named reroute node, or in our named reroutes, we're going to add in the grass spawner. We're going to right click and search for a surface sampler. We're going to plug that in, and let's actually disable the trees and the rocks by selecting the static mesh spawner nodes and pressing the E key on those. And with the surface sampler for our grass, we're going to press the D key, and then what we'll do is we will adjust some of these points. So for the grass, let's maybe reduce or increase the density, I should say, by setting these point extents to about 5, and they get quite small. We're also going to set the looseness. We're also going to set the looseness to about 0.25 to kind of spread it out a little bit. And we're going to increase the points per squared meter to something like 15. And now I've got all these little points all over our scene. So the points per meter squared will in fact increase the density of these nodes. And we could technically do that with the trees as well. We could reduce the looseness, like 0.5. Or better yet, let's say 0.25. And enable that. see, we have significantly more trees. All right, so now we're going to continue building upon our grass. So let's go ahead and add in a self-pruning node. We're going to also add in the transform points. And a static mesh spawner. Let's go ahead and set the transform points to 360-degree rotation on the Z with absolute rotation and absolute rotation toggled on. We're also going to set the minimum scale to 0.35. Again, these are just values you can change on your own and play around with it, see what you like. I'm just giving you some values that I've had some success with. And I think that should be sufficient for this. And what we're going to do next is add in our static meshes. So if you press and hold Control Space, we'll expand this content browser, and I'm just going to choose the grasses. There's also some plants you could use, but we're going to stick with grass for now. I'm going to use, actually, might as well use just a few of these. I'm going to use 1 to 3, and feel free to add more if you'd like. So with my static mesh spawner selected, I'm going to go to the mesh entries, add in those 3 entries. We don't want collision on these, so you can ignore that part. And there we go. I've got grass 01, grass 02, and grass 03. Okay, and so now what we're going to do is I'm going to disable the debug on that surface sampler. I'm going to minimize, and we can see all the grass on our landscape. And if you'd like to make it a little bit more lush, you obviously can, simply by editing the data in the surface sampler. You could even add in some additional static mesh objects. So maybe I'll add in another one, and just going to go to the plants. It looks like it's SM plant 01. Let's just double check that that is correct. That's just a normal plant. I'm going to go ahead and add in plant SM plant 01. So I'm going to expand this. And with it selected, I can just click on that arrow. And let's see how that looks. Oof, that's quite dense. I don't think I like that. So I think I'm going to use clover instead. There we go. Yeah, I think that's what I'll do. So I'm going to add a different mesh. So I'm going to press Control Space, and I'm going to add in this clover asset. So there we go. I've added that in, and I'm going to go ahead and save. And let's take a look at that asset. So we've got quite a bit of clover. You can adjust this later if you choose to. Now, one thing I want to do before we move forward is I want to add a material to my landscape, because right now this checkerboard pattern is pretty boring. So to add a material to the landscape, we're going to first locate the landscape in our world outliner and scroll through the details panel to locate the landscape material. We're going to expand that, and I'm actually going to go to the hand-painted environments content browser folder, expand that, go to assets, landscape, And here you'll see materials. We're going to just drag the landscape material directly over top of that, or you could just click on this arrow to assign it. And you're going to notice that your landscape is quite shiny. We're going to fix this really quick. So let's go over to the selection mode and choose landscape. And we're going to go over to this paint tab and scroll all the way down. We're going to get a warning or notification, I should say, that's just instructing us to essentially create some layer data or assign layer data to the surface. So we can do that by clicking on this button here. It says create layers from assigned materials. Let's go ahead and click on that. And after that's done, we're going to have to essentially prime this surface by painting every single one of these textures onto the landscape. So we're going to select the first one and increase the size of your brush to its maximum size. I use my opening and closing brackets, but you can edit that directly inside of the brush settings here. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly paint my grass onto this surface, just like so. And I'll do that with this other material. And I'm going to keep on doing that with every single material until the surface is completely primed. All right, so now that that is done, what we're going to do is we're going to paint out areas where there would be grass. So let's just assume all of this space will have grass, and I'm going to have a little patch, let's say, over in the corner here, where it's just going to be stone floor. In this corner, it will be just my stone floor. You can see grass is actually growing over top of the stone. We're obviously not going to want that. And in fact, I'm just going to delineate this space with this stone patch because I don't want any grass growing around there. Let's just use some grass to kind of clean this up. And also you can increase the tool strength. All right, so now that I have this texture painted, I'm going to go back to selection mode and we are going to go back to our PCG graph. What we're going to want to do is use a filter, in this case an attribute filter, to separate the grass from landscape materials like this stone. So to do that, we're just going to simply right click in this empty space and look for the attribute filter. So with the attribute filter, what we can do is we can identify our target. We could control the flow of this node using the operator. We can change the target attribute to various points, so based on the density, scale, rotation, color, etc. We can also just type in whatever value we want. So to determine which value this stone material is, I could just look at my landscape mode paint option where I have the stone floor, and I could just copy the name here. But alternatively, you could select your surface sampler, and if you press the A key, that will display the attributes of this object. And if we select the PCG volume, PCG component in our debug tree and scroll this bar all the way to the right, you'll see we have various names for the materials that exist on our landscape. In this case, we can use grass 1 as the example material. So we're going to select this attribute filter and let's toggle on use constant threshold, and we're going to say if this operator is greater than, let's change this double value to like 0.5. So if the value is greater than 0.5, then it will display the grass mesh on the surface. But if it's lower than that, it won't display anything. So we're going to use this attributes list here, and let's make sure we copy this name. You can just right click here and copy the attribute name. I'm going to paste that right into the target attribute like so. I'm just going to move these nodes off to the side a little bit, and I'm going to plug the surface sampler into our attribute filter and the inside filter into self-pruning. I'm just going to straighten these out a little bit. And let's actually take a look at that right now. So I'm going to minimize this. And you'll see here, I now have grass spawning only in areas where I have grass 1 painted and not on the stone. And if I were to even select grass 2 and start painting, it won't actually show up in that section. Okay, so let's go back to our graph, and what we're going to do is we're just going to turn off the inspector for this surface sampler. And let's re-enable the static mesh spawner for both our trees and our rocks. I'm going to go view this in my scene, and you can see that the trees and rocks are not affected by the attribute filter. So you can certainly have an attribute filter for each of these. And if you change the operator to something that's like, let's say, less than 0.5, what will happen is it will start displaying the meshes on the opposing surface. So if you have like an embankment and you want certain assets to appear along that embankment, you can easily achieve that. So I'm going to set that back to greater than. And I'm going to align some of my nodes. So again, to do that, you just select the nodes that you want to align, press Alt-Shift-S, and that should line those up for you. We're also going to add a comment box around our grass. So let's select those nodes and press the C key, type in grass, and I'm going to assign a color. You can actually copy an existing color. So I'm going to select the comment color for my trees, copy that, and select my grass comment box and paste that in there, like so. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add in a difference node. So I'm going to right click and type in difference. And this time we're actually going to make the grass our source. So I'm going to expand this. And right before the static mesh spawner, I'm going to place my difference node. So again, this is going to be our source. And the output from the transform points of our trees and rocks are going to go directly into there. You're noticing now that it is getting quite chaotic and busy. I would definitely recommend creating some reroute nodes to kind of clean that up. But for now, I just want to test this out to make sure that it works as intended. So let's go ahead and save our graph and check this out. Now, one thing I forgot to do was ensure that the difference node was set to binary. So let's go ahead and click on that difference node and set it to binary. Make sure to save your graph, and let's take a look at that now. Now grass won't spawn inside trees or rocks. So that's pretty handy. Now let's go back to our event graph. What we're going to do next is make a slight adjustment to the surface sampler. I'm just going to rearrange some of these nodes as well. It looks like they're getting a little bit cluttered and bunched up. So I'm going to select my surface sampler for the tree spawner, and I'm going to increase the points per squared meter and just have a look at what happens here. When I set this points to square meter to 1 and the looseness to something like 1.25, you'll notice that the tree actually will grow over top of the rock. And so we're going to want to fix that similarly to what we did with the difference node here. But before we do that, let's try to clean up the chaos that we see here with the spaghetti string code. So let's create another reroute node. Let's type in reroute, and we could add in a named reroute. And we're going to call this one rock exclusion. And let's go ahead and add that rock exclusion node right there, and we can break this connection. Plug it right into the difference here. We'll do the same thing with our trees. Let's go ahead and create a new reroute node. And again, to rename it, you just press the F2 key, and we'll do tree exclusion. And we'll come down here, add the tree exclusion reroute node. We'll break this connection and make sure you save, and let's just confirm that this works. Okay, so we know that the grass will not grow inside of the trees. Gets close, but it won't grow inside the trees or the rocks. So that's good. And so now let's go back into the graph. And we'll do the same thing with the rock. So we're going to grab another difference node, or we could just duplicate this one. So select it and press Control D. I'm going to position that just in front of the static mesh spawner. So I actually don't need that node right now. I'm going to push that off to the side, and I'll just position that here in the difference section. And I'll add in my named reroute for the tree spawner, or sorry, the tree exclusion, and plug that into difference. Plug that into the static mesh spawner. And let's quickly take a look at that. So now you'll see that the rocks are no longer spawning inside of the trees, and we can further demonstrate that by increasing the density of the rocks themselves. So if I set this to like 50, 50, 50, we're going to have a significantly larger amount of rocks in that space. And we could do the same thing with our trees. So the surface sampler point extents are set to 200, but if I set that to 100 by 100 by 100, it should prevent rocks and trees from colliding with each other. So that's looking significantly better. And that wraps up part 1 of our PCG Unleashed tutorial series. I hope you enjoyed learning the fundamentals of building dynamic procedural landscapes in Unreal Engine 5. In part 2, we're diving even deeper. We'll tackle subgraphs and explore the implementation of hero assets to take your procedural systems to the next level. Thanks for watching, and if you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a thing. See you next time.